Thanks, Jane. And yeah, thank you everybody for bearing with us. It's the nature, I think, of doing these things online now that there's always a little bit of funny business, but sure doesn't it remind us that this is live and connect us in a different way. So good afternoon and thank you for joining us this afternoon, for your patience for our event, Industry, the Modern Day Medicis. My name is Aisling Murray and I'm the head of programming here at Science Gallery Dublin. And we're really excited about the panel of speakers and the conversation that we have for you this afternoon. My job really is to make you aware of your fire exit, which is the door through which you came, and in this case, the leave button on the bottom right of your window, and to really give you an introduction to our conversation today. And we'll have a Q&A at the end, so please submit any questions in the chat or over social media over the course of the conversation. Over the past 18 months, we've been collaborating with the DOC, Accenture's flagship R&D and Global Innovation Centre based in Dublin. And this is really a space where design, business and technology come together under one roof. And what was supposed to be an artist-in-residence program quickly became an artist-in-remoteness program, which culminated in a new artwork, Air by Multiplay, which is currently viewable through the windows of the gallery on Pier Street. And we'd encourage you to check out our website, dublin.sciencegallery.com, for other upcoming program activity, including offsite events, our new podcast series, as well as the exhibits viewable in the window. Something which we kept coming back to over the course of our collaboration was what happens at the intersection of academic or scientific research, industry research, and artistic practice. And really that was the spark that fed this conversation. So with that, I'll hand you over to our moderator for this evening, Jess Magico-Dunmee, Director of Human Insights Lab at the DOC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisling, and thank you for the Science Gallery Dublin for hosting this talk as well. And I promise, I think it's going to be a talk worth waiting for. So thank you everyone for your patience. In a moment, I'll just introduce the panelists, but to pick up on some of those questions that we are going to be talking about, is industry the modern day Medici? How can artists get more out of working with industry, and how can industry get more out of working with artists? And possibly the panel that we have lined up, all of whom have been working with industry, might even suggest that they are the wrong questions to be asking. So with that, let me introduce you to Julia Kagansky, who's a curator and cultural strategist and the founding director of New Ink, a museum-led incubator in New York. And she's joining us from Savannah. Moment. Welcome, Julia. We also have Mike Tyker, who is academically a biochemist, a biophysicist. I think I'm missing, there's potentially more bios there as well. He was one of the co-creators of Rubik's Cube in 2009. He joined Google in 2012. And artistically, he works with artificial neural networks and is joining us today from Seattle. You're very welcome, Mike. And lastly, we have Aoife van Lindenthal, who is a multidisciplinary artist. Her practice spans sculpture, installation, performance. In 2016, 2017, she started an artist-in-residence program with the European Space Agency and seems to have been hooked on space ever since, literally just recently coming out of 9.5 days in isolation in a moon simulation. Welcome, Aoife. Welcome to Earth from London. You're dialing in. Thank you so much. To kick us off, Julia, I might actually turn to you because I'm really interested by what you did with New Ink and that model that was set up there. And I watched a talk you gave back, I think in 2014, 2015, around how when you started, it had that core assumption that interdisciplinary collaboration produced more interesting and innovative ideas. So having gone through everything you did with New Ink and your work since, do you think that still holds, that assumption?
I mean, I do. I kind of find it to not be a very controversial statement. Maybe that's just the circles that I run in. But I think, the world that we're living in is so complex that it requires many different minds to come together to make meaning and combine different ways of knowing, different ways of doing to produce things that respond to the world that we're living in. And I don't know, I've had that confirmed for me personally time and time again. And artistically, I think a lot of the work that we're seeing today draws on so many different forms of creative expression and synthesizes them into something new. So it really brings together people who might have expertise in music or 3D graphics or software design or hardware design, and together through their kind of collective efforts, they're able to produce something that's kind of a total sum of its parts, or more than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose actually thinking about all three of you on this talk, you are within yourselves embracing interdisciplinary practice in many ways. Mike, you are equal parts researcher and artist, it seems, through everything that you do. And I'm wondering, when you joined Google, how did that enhance or perhaps challenge your research interests and your creative process?
Yeah, I mean, I find that my artistic output is always sort of heavily influenced by what I work on in the work part of life. So when I was working as a biochemist on proteins, I started making protein sculptures, like traditional sculpture, but of scientific subject matter. And then when I was working at Google, machine learning was what I was working on, and so naturally that's where my attention went. It's just what's in my brain, essentially. Whatever I'm already thinking about influences my artistic thoughts as well.
And so I wonder what happens when space is in your brain, Aoife. I mean, like literally, the realm of a moonshot collaboration. It strikes me that potentially, an organization like that who really tries to push things to the limit would be quite a free creative environment potentially to embrace an artist in residence. Is that what you found in your experience?
I think there are different kind of sides to it. I mean, there are lots of people in the space industry who are open and see the value in the art science kind of engagement and collaboration. And yeah, you're right. There's something about the nature of working in outer space, like really the edge of exploration of knowledge, the human, physical and technological capabilities that you're completely testing. So they are inherently open-minded, inherently open to kind of any suggestion. Saying that, I think there is this sense that the value of the artist is really in education of science. And in outreach, which is quite important for scientific organizations, well, at least space agencies that are funded by the public. And they don't see the value necessarily in art for science and what that, and they do really think of it as art and not as what all of us might think as a kind of creative practitioner, that none of us just make art, right? We do many things. We talk, we hold workshops, we develop culture and evolve culture on Earth. So they don't think about themselves as culture creators in space. So yeah, I think there's a lack of knowledge of what it means to have a true collaboration, but they are keen and they want to do this. And I think there's a kind of zeitgeist happening now where they realize if we're going to go and live on the moon and work on the moon, that we need to open up the directives of the space agencies beyond science and into this cultural realm of which they are not experts. So I think this is a kind of what I realized was happening at the time I was there. But in general, also, I think artists can be seen as a bit of a high risk. They can be seen as a kind of wild card. So in an organization where security is really important and information security especially, they're quite careful with artists sometimes as well.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if, Julia, for the museum, was that sense of kind of inviting in high risk, if you like, artists who maybe weren't necessarily driving towards a commercial goal, that you were very open to what might happen with them. did you feel like it was high risk, or how did you manage and navigate all those competing interests in terms of let's create value from this incubator?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're doing something that is experimental, that, you know, hasn't been done before, and you really don't know what to expect, there's a lot of risk involved. You know, I think for the museum, there was a pretty high tolerance for, you know, failure or the possibility of failure. And I think anytime that you're, you know, working in a new relationship, you're, you know, commissioning new work, even, like, you don't know what the end result is going to be, because whatever the artist's proposal might look like, where they end up might be something completely different. And, you know, some artists are even tricksters, so they might, you know, pull switcheroos. So I think anytime you're embarking on this kind of new journey with an artist, you never really know what you're going to get. So you have to be prepared for the unexpected.
And I suppose I actually saw a few of you kind of smiling when I suggested that maybe some of the questions that we'd pose might be the wrong question. And maybe, Mike, I can ask you about that, this idea of kind of, if it's possible to collaborate with compromise. Would you have an answer for that? Or would you even challenge that question itself based on what you've done?
That's a good, I think it's a good question. I don't think there are bad questions. Yeah, I mean, the collaborating in this space can definitely be tricky from a number of perspectives. And like, for example, even so, when Deep Dream first was created by Alex, and we were looking at these very strange and disturbing pictures, and we wanted to release them and sort of push them in the art direction. There was definitely a certain unease at first about how the public would react to these images and what, you know. But in the end, they sort of came around that this was, if anything, valuable thing to, you know, worth discussing and talking about, and it was fine. But the risks definitely come up.
Yeah, those images at once are fascinating and draw you in, and almost kind of simultaneously repel you in a way. You react to them. Did you find then in your role you had to convince people to do this, for it to go more public to a broader audience? Is that also the role of an artist or a curator within that industry relationship?
Well, I was not, I suppose I was wearing both hats, but yeah, I definitely ended up advocating for openness and transparency, and just going with it, because we felt that this was going to be visible sooner or later anyway, so might as well just roll with it.
Mm-hmm. Aoife, I wonder about that tension, whether that rings true for you, that there is, you know, challenges, tensions, convincing. Is that inevitable with any type of industry collaboration, do you think?
I mean, I think it's not necessarily inevitable, depending on how you approach it. And I think one of the first things to do when you're approaching something is understand your boundaries, right? And kind of, if anyone knows me and knows I'm going to go and do a talk somewhere, the first thing I'm going to ask is, how big is the room? How many seats are there? Can I move the seats? Is there, are there windows? Can I cover up the windows? Is it possible to switch off the lights? So I start with a series of questions so that I can understand how I can manipulate the space. And I think it's the same if you're collaborating. Like, what are the limits of access? What are the limits of doing? Like, how can I actually do something? Am I able to have time on a telescope, for example? And there's a kind of trust, I think, yeah, kind of, in some ways you do have to convince sometimes the science organizations that artists are intelligent enough or capable enough or have enough skills to be able to handle and work with the right data or equipment in a careful and respectful way. So I think it really depends on the boundaries of the space. So for example, I did have to push a bit to be able to do all of my activities at ESA, but I was very lucky to have the ESA team who was sort of hosting the residency was the communications team, and they were very dedicated. And so they really had to work, you know, they thought there's this sort of perception that an artist collaboration involves the artist visiting and kind of harvesting information, right? So you get a tour and you get to talk to people, and there's, but the actual doing is not really seen as, they not quite often don't consider the doing of the work and the art and the involvement of the scientists and potentially actually creating a project together. And I suppose that aspect of it sometimes does, when that's not really cohesively formed, this plan of how it works ahead of time, then you can land in this space and you're trying to figure out how that collaboration is even going to happen. And so then there is some convincing and stuff like that too. But yeah, I don't think it has to be that way. I think if these conversations can start early and people can really think of these artistic projects as projects that they would do in their normal work time, I think that could really change.
And I think that's an interesting point about, you know, it's almost at once we're trying to find alignment, but that actual idea of establishing those boundaries, where are the limits around that? And I wonder what the go ahead.
I was just thinking about, so it made me think of the compromise issue. And I think if you go in understanding your boundaries, as an artist, we naturally just explore, right? We go, okay, right, what can we do? We just start absorbing and exploring and testing. And if we have that kind of sense of what we're able to do and what the realm in which we're able to work, then I don't think we need to compromise, because we're already coming in with a kind of landscape of where we can play, you know, in a sense. And I use the word play in a kind of serious work sense as well. But it's, yeah, in that sense, I think there is no compromise, because you're working with a set of tools and a set of people, and you're working with minds together, and you're not necessarily compromising, you're exploring what's available. So yeah, it just made me think of that.
Mike, I saw you nodding as Aoife was talking there about the boundaries. Can you think of a time where you've had to establish or re-establish those boundaries in order to get a positive collaborative relationship?
I don't know if I have a specific example, but this is maybe a slightly different aspect of this kind of collaboration. But when we were setting up collaborations with engineers and artists, especially in the residency program context, another challenge we faced was that sometimes it was difficult to find a common language, even where just getting the engineers to explain the limits of the technology. And it's a different kind of limit that you encounter, right? Like sometimes the artists would say, well, we want to do this thing. And the engineer's like, but we would need 1 million images of this thing to train, say, this neural network, but we only have 100. And so now we're running into a different kind of limitations where sort of like the artist's vision exceeds what can technically be done. And so finding that common ground between that on that axis has also been challenging sometimes.
Julia, I wonder, as a creator, do you get boundaries on both sides that you have to establish?
Well, I think I have a sort of similar experience where, you know, I was working with an artist who's also working in AI, and was specifically interested in creating her own data set and working with a very small data set of kind of trying to bring the data down to a more personal, anecdotal level. And knowing that that would not yield kind of perfect results that would meet a sort of industry standard of polish and perfection, but that in a way was was the goal, was part of the work for this artist. And I think oftentimes industry and artists are coming at these problems with different motivations and different expectations and different kind of pressures from within the worlds in which they circulate. And that, kind of getting to this common ground of why are we doing this work? What is the intended result? And is it okay that it may not work perfectly, but there's still something in, the way that it breaks down that is potentially, poetic or meaningful or revealing something to us about the technology that we wouldn't otherwise get to see.
In a few moments, we're going to be inviting in questions from anybody who's listening. So please do type your questions into the chat. This is your 5-minute warning on that, because I still have a few more questions myself that I'd love to ask. And I think there's almost a sense of when you enter into any relationship, all the parties carry an obligation in a means of respecting that relationship. And I'm curious as to what you think the obligations might be for artists compared to industry partners, or indeed curators in this type of collaboration between industry and art. And I might ask that first to Aoife.
Yeah, I mean, I think the obligations really are, as an artist, to actually in some ways go in with a bit more open mind. I think sometimes we do have a very strong vision of what we want to do and we have a brief, but so oftentimes when you get to a place or you start to explore, you might, your interest might go on a different trajectory, but also the boundaries might not be what you think they're going to be. We have expectations, they might change. And I think your obligation or kind of your best thing to do is really just go with it. We're quite often in life put in places that we don't expect, or things aren't what we wanted them to be, or it's not what we imagined. And I think making sure that we really focus on what is there and what we have got and what is available. I think learn the language of the space that you're going to. If it's a scientific, your area of interest, it will mean that you can really talk and involve yourself better. You can really get down to business instead of starting at the beginning, essentially. And you'll get much more out of it. And I think for the organizations, the main responsibility is to understand that it is work, as I mentioned before, and that you need to dedicate time for the organization for that to really get the full experience and benefit. And I think understanding and talking beforehand about what collaboration is and how you can see that happening. I think beyond that, it's really about, yeah, I mean, I think those are the main things.
Yeah, when we already mentioned, language being that both a barrier and potentially a shortcut to accelerating the relationship. Mike, from your perspective, how do you consider those, maybe obligations is a harsh word, maybe responsibilities that both parties need to bring?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think obligations is kind of a hard word because that just depends on whatever agreement exists between, say, the industry partner and the artist. But I was thinking more in the sense of opportunity. Like if somebody says, yeah, we will collaborate, we want to collaborate with an artist, then if there isn't a willingness from that party to have a little vulnerability and be a little open to somewhat unexpected results, then why are you even doing it? And I think that's where the opportunity is to learn something you didn't know before, and not let there be a certain amount of openness to that relationship and the conversation. I think that's where the opportunity is. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mike. And Julia, do you have a perspective on this as well? Does it align with Mike and Aoife, or would you perhaps challenge something they've said?
I mean, I think Mike and Aoife both gave really great answers. I'm over here thinking about not so much obligations or opportunities, but I'm actually thinking about power dynamics. Because I think, oftentimes it's really challenging for an artist to be this kind of soul, like change agent or disruptor, like that's brought into a company or a research lab, has to learn that culture, has to learn that language, has to understand the work that's being done there, and has to kind of convince other people to trust them to bring a different perspective and a different way of thinking and working. And a lot of times I have been in situations where the funder has certain ideas about what they're going to get out of this experience as well, and that can create a situation where there's a lot of pressure being exerted on of this process, right? And artists might oftentimes are much more interested in the process itself versus the thing that is going to be delivered, that's going to be put up on a pedestal and said like this is the art output. I think what is oftentimes the most meaningful work is the exchange. Anyway, so I think the power dynamics at play are also kind of interesting to look at. And I'd be curious to see more art and industry collaborations where we're bringing, researchers from industry into an art gallery and asking them to collaborate with artists and seeing what happens there.
I love that twist on the power dynamics, and I'm playing around with just that sense of it's a value exchange, it's a knowledge exchange of ideas, as opposed to quite a transactional, here we're commissioning you to do this. And actually some of the questions coming in are assigned to pick up on this. So I hear there's lots more questions. I'm just going to start with one that caught my eye, and it says, reflecting on your experience, is industry interested to sponsor cultural and artistic practice, mainly when there is a direct outcome which is useful or relevant to their business? And I suppose, Julie, you already spoke to that, so I might throw this to Mike or Aoife to add in from their own experience and what they've seen. I'll go Aoife.
I mean, I guess it's a little bit, my sort of segue in has been the residency open call and then sort of immersing myself in the space industry. So I guess it's in terms of just reaching out to various industries of your area of interest. I don't know how easy that is. I mean, in terms of gaining sponsorship, there's always a kind of process, unless they are quite well known in the sort of arts industry as somebody that puts out open calls. It can be very difficult to find the right person to speak to in a company. And likely if you do, you might hit the right person and get some funding. But from my experience, that's very difficult because you just don't know how to reach out sometimes. Although saying that, I would also say one of the big experiences with the space industry is that you can reach out, and if you do meet the right person and you have a great idea and it is interesting, then you will likely get funded because people do believe in what you're doing, and they are excited by artist projects. And if they have the money, they will quite often sponsor things. But I think that challenge is really finding the right people. But I think maybe Mike could probably answer that better in terms of that bridge.
I don't know if I have much to add here.
That's okay. There are lots of questions coming in. There are so many. So I'm going to throw some out that maybe you might be interested, because this is quite an interesting one about someone who's just saying that really excited about the potential of industry, scientific, artistic collaborations, but wondering if the panelists could speak a little bit about IP. or how ownership is managed through those relationships. So Mike, maybe you could speak a bit to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing we learned is that it's really important to settle that question beforehand. So in all of the residencies, we always had a very explicit contract with all the artists that we sponsored. And we pushed pretty hard to make sure that all the IP actually remains with the artist. And that was a really nice outcome and created a really good relationship.
I can answer that a little bit as well. So in terms of IP generally, the artist will retain the IP, although the contract will always have a clause which allows the organization or company to use images or material produced via social media or within their own content as they see fit in a way. It's really important to ensure that this is credited wherever images are shared or wherever the work is shared. There have been cases where people have used my image, the images of my work, and not credited me, which is frustrating because, so, you know, you kind of need to politely follow up with people if that happens, but you always retain your IP, and that you also should know that you retain your IP on any photography that is done of your work as well. So yeah, that's the kind of usual arrangement that I've experienced.
And would that be another one of those boundaries that you established at the beginning? Yeah.
Yes, and I think it is general good practice in the industry, and I think there is a kind of standard there for that.
Julia, at New Ink, how did it work there?
Very similar. I mean, basically, very much in line with what Afe just outlined. I think it's crucial that artists retain the rights to their work. Of course, industry partners will want to have some ability to share that work, to speak about it. Oftentimes there's also like a, maybe a non-disclosure agreement as well if they're working with some sort of proprietary technology that you can't publicly share, but the artist has access to. But yeah, I think a baseline would be the artists retaining copyright.
Oh, and then just I should mention, if artists are interested in this, that the IP normally, in terms of giving the company permission to use it, is normally in terms of the residency itself. So if they then wanted to use your images for commercial purposes, that should come under a different contract, ideally. So they shouldn't then take your image and use it for a big advertising campaign or something like that. That would be a separate contract, and that would be expected a further payment, for example. It's unlikely that that would happen in that kind of case, but it just depends on who you're working with.
Thanks for that, Ad. So from IP then, there's a question around education. Question is, how many of these issues of intersection arise, in your opinion, from the gradual establishment of STEM education as separate from STEAM? Julia, do you want to perhaps offer a view on that, about that role of, that STEM education, I suppose, really bringing forth this wave of interdisciplinary intersections of business, industry, research, art?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've seen increasing kind of specialization and just like a removal of this kind of more integrated approach to understanding the world around us through many lenses. And I think there's nothing wrong with expertise and specialization, but being able to move across to different forms of knowledge and ways of understanding the world is crucial, especially in this point in time. And yeah, I think we need to bring arts and humanities back into the fold. And I think that's been happening with the STEAM movement. But for a long time, especially in the computer age, maths and science and engineering have really been have become kind of superlative somehow as more important. And I think we need to bring the arts back into that.
Thank you. Well, I think we just got time for one more question. I'm going to ask this question to all three of you before we wrap up. It comes from Nicole McCormack, who says, loved hearing from the panelists. Great talk. And her question is, she's curious to know what your dream collaboration would be. Give you all a moment to have a think, dream. Aoife, you're smiling. Do you know straight away what your dream collaboration would be? You're nodding. Okay, what is your dream collaboration?
Yeah, I'm working on it at the moment. I mean, so my dream collaboration is working with European Space Agency in particular. Obviously, I'm very tied with them, or space agencies in the conscious cultural development of outer space. So obviously, I'm working in that realm at the moment, but I've just launched a project called the Outer Space Cultural Experimental Laboratory. So what does it look like to have a cultural lab in space, and how can we develop culture and explore and really become, look at what the limits and push those boundaries of what we can be is, and really getting the space agencies and organizations on board with this. So I've kind of humbly launched it in my analog space mission. And I'm starting to write up some papers and present it at the International Congress and things like that. So I'm hoping that there's a kind of zeitgeist at the moment in the space industry, and that they're really gonna potentially pick up on this. So that is my dream collaboration, is having an experimental lab on the ISS or on the moon. And yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. It does sound pretty awesome. What about you, Mike? What would your dream collaboration be?
I don't know if I have a specific entity I want to work with, but what's been on my mind mostly in the last year is climate change. And so I've been thinking around that space and looking for ways to combine it with arts. And I've ended up working a bunch in this space for the last year, and there are a lot of things that are really unintuitive about it. You know, I find that we think, okay, we'll just need to plant more trees or something. It's not as simple as that. There's a lot of weird, difficult feedback loops and things that are really unintuitive. So it'd be cool to make some sort of art that makes this a little bit easier to understand, to get back to the education and communication points that's been raised already. That would be my next dream, I think.
Delving into things that aren't intuitive in that space. Yeah, love that. Thank you, Mike. And Julia, what would your dream collaboration be?
I mean, I've also been researching the climate change, climate science space quite a bit. And I think that's a perfect example of a space that really requires this kind of interdisciplinary thinking and whole systems approach in order to be able to address a problem like this. Because, you know, everything is interconnected and interdependent. And in order to be able to communicate an issue such as climate change, or to be able to conceive of possible interventions into that space, I think we need to bring the arts and the sciences together to even be able to develop a language, be it verbal or visual or what have you, to get us into a place where we're able to conceptualize these problems or possible solutions.
Yeah, can I just add to that as well? I think there's something about working creatively, you know, before we mentioned in the preamble about ecosystems, and you know, I think there's something about working creatively that lets go of fear, because working creatively solves problems. And even if you have to turn your perspective or your approach or your method upside down, you trust the process and you don't hang on to old working ideas. And in order to solve something like climate change, businesses are going to need to become very creative, and they're going to need to adapt to not just becoming more sort of sustainable as such, but also potentially, you know, economics are going to have to completely change. We cannot, you know, continue with the kind of economics that we have at the moment. And businesses are afraid of this, of course, right? Because if we don't have this kind of set of economics, what are we going to do? Whereas the creative ecosystem is not afraid. We are totally happy to jump into this new world and the more businesses can foster this creative ecosystem, the more likely they're going to be able to make the right decisions for the future of the planet without fearing for their own kind of success or survival. So yeah.
And I love how this somehow has come back around to this sense of, being willing to take that risk, that perceived risk that perhaps comes with a really open collaboration with people who maybe have a completely different process to your own, and what that can bring. Gosh, we've had such a wonderful discussion from around. I think language came through very much about establishing that common language. And Julia, I loved how you kind of added in that could be a visual language. It doesn't have to be just about understanding the definitions of words, or indeed it could be a technical language around the limitations around that. I've been very struck by that sense of the boundaries as well, and establishing those. And we'll try to implement that going forward in all the collaborations as well, as opposed to just about alignment, also about those boundaries and expectations. But I think ultimately this comes back around to us feeling like we are culture created in a way that is adding more value to all sides of the collaboration. And maybe we've been tripped up in that last sentence there by calling it sides. Maybe that is completely be falling into old ways of thinking around what it is to collaborate. So I'd like to thank all of you, Julia, Mike, Aoife, so much for your time, your thoughts, your ideas, your generosity with your stories of collaborating. And thank you also to Science Gallery and Trinity College. And thank you all very much for watching this talk, which will be available on playback, so please do share it.